Welcome to our program today, Betty Friedan, Magnificent Disruptor. Our speaker today, Rachel Shteir, is the author of 4 books. They are Striptease, The Untold Story of the Girly Show, Gypsy, The Art of the Tease, and The Steal, A Cultural History of Shoplifting. She has written for magazines, newspapers, and blogs, including the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Tablet, The Nation, and the Washington Post. Rachel is associate professor of the theater school at DePaul University. Before going to Chicago in 2000, she taught at a variety of very good universities, Yale, Carnegie Mellon, Columbia University, and the National Theater Institute. She holds a BA from the University of Chicago and an MFA from the Yale School of Drama. And now, very glad to introduce to you Rachel Shteir, author of Betty Friedan, Magnificent Disruptor. Take it away.
Reva, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for coming to hear a little bit about my new biography about Betty Friedan. And of course, I also want to thank Jewish Book Council Network for their amazing partnership and sponsorship. So what am I going to do tonight? I will talk for about, I don't know, 35 or plus or 40 minutes about Betty Friedan and her life and work. And then I would love to hear questions from you all. Let me start though by just saying a little bit about how I came to write this book. Because you may have noticed in my biography that my first 3 books were not about Betty Friedan. And so you might be wondering, how did this happen? And how it happened was about 10 years ago, which was the 50th anniversary of Betty Friedan's great work, The Feminine Mystique. Some of you may be familiar with that work. It was published in 1963 and was a huge bestseller and changed many women's lives. That was the thing that when women came up to Betty, I'm going to call her Betty because I worked on this book for 6 years, so I feel like I can call her by her first name. Well, Betty, they would come up to her and they would say, "You changed my life," by which they meant they had been suffering alone in their houses, thinking that they alone noticed the same problems that Betty writes about in The Feminine Mystique. But anyway, in 2013, 10 years ago, I was asked to write an essay about the 50th anniversary of The Feminine Mystique. And at the time, I had never read The Feminine Mystique, so I had to read it. And I was blown away. If you have not read it recently, I highly recommend it. It's not what I don't know, you might have an idea of it in your head. It's really very beautifully written, for one thing. It's not very polemical. It's a kind of uplifting book in a way. It's really a study of a disease that Betty saw afflicting American women, and that disease was basically a kind of stereotyping and confining of American women in their roles as wives and mothers. And Betty wrote The Feminine Mystique to try and diagnose, if you will, this disease, and then to try, I guess, and help others to overcome it. But The Feminine Mystique is, it doesn't really have any suggestions for how women should do this. At the end of the book, it makes suggestions that, from our perspective today, are very kind of non-political, like, for example, there should be universal childcare, right? Of course, we don't have universal childcare, but that was a suggestion that Betty made. And then another one was just women should pursue their passions. So it's not, Betty was not in any way in this book suggesting down with the patriarchy or anything like that. I think that's a common misconception about Betty and what she stood for. Each section of the feminine mystique deals with a different realm in society. For example, there's one section on advertising and how advertising stereotypes women by making them want to buy things. There's another section on higher ed and how higher ed holds women back. There's another section on sociology. Okay, and so Betty goes through kind of methodically these different realms, and in each realm she finds that women are being shrunken down to these cliches, these stereotypes. Okay, but what I want to tell you about, so I was writing this essay 10 years ago, and also I was, in addition to writing about the feminine mystique, I was asked to write about some feminist manifestos that had been published that same year, 2013. And one of them, for example, was Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In. Some of you may have heard of that book. It was a pretty well publicized book at the time. And so I read those books. And what I began to think about was the fact that few of the books, the new books, mention Betty. If they did mention her, it was in this tiny little footnote or something. And I began to feel like she had been erased somewhat from the conversation, that people didn't remember her, or if they did remember her, they misremembered her. And so that was what I wrote about in this piece in 2013, and people really liked it. And not long after that, I was asked to write this book about this biography for the series Yale Jewish Lives, which is an excellent series with a really wide range of Jewish figures in it. And I was very proud to be asked to do it and happy to do so. So that was my introduction 10 years ago to the feminine mystique and to writing this book. Okay, and I want to now tell you a little bit about Betty's biography, just so that you can have a fuller picture of it. The one thing I want to talk about is Betty was a Midwesterner. She was born in 1921 in Peoria, Illinois, which is about 3 hours south by car of where I am sitting right now in Chicago. So it's in southern Illinois. Peoria is a small town, and Betty's parents were Betty's father was Harry Sr. was he ran a jewelry store, and her mother was a housewife, Miriam, and did volunteer work for various organizations, some Jewish, others not Jewish. They were a reform family, and they experienced anti-Semitism in Peoria, as did Betty, and that shaped her. That was one of the key things that shaped her and that drove her to write about the injustices that had been done to women. So she was born, as I said, in 1921 in Peoria, and she grew up there. She had 2 siblings, a younger brother, Harry, and a younger sister, Amy. And from the very beginning, from her birth, it was clear that Betty really struggled being in Peoria, and felt constrained by being in Peoria, and specifically felt constrained by her mother, Miriam, the housewife. And because her mother before she had married, she had worked as a journalist and doing other things. And then, of course, when she married, she immediately stopped working and had a family, and she was very unhappy, and even to the point of making herself sick. And so Betty, of course, being in the family, noticed all of this, and it affected her very deeply as a child. And she really rebelled against it as a child in various ways. Some of the ways were, fighting with her sister, right? She, even when she was a child, as a child, Betty had a temper, right, which would later become important. Um, she also read. She lost herself in books, right? She tried to immerse herself in books and in school. She was a brilliant student. Even as a child, she founded various organizations, different clubs that, they would get other students all riled up when the substitute teacher came to school. So she loved being in groups, but she also loved being alone in solitude and reading books. And eventually, she applied and went to Smith College, which was where her grandfather did not allow her mother to go, back in the 19 teens, before her mother had been married. Her mother had wanted to go there and had not been able to. So Betty, by going there, fulfilled her mother's dream. And that was in 1938. She started college in 1938, during the Depression. The family, of course, as I said, her father ran this jewelry store that was, it was called the Tiffany's of the Midwest or something like that. That was its moniker. And but they suffered a downturn, in their financial life, in the Depression, and Betty also suffered from that as well. But in 38, as I said, she went to Smith, and at Smith, she began to find, she found a new kind of balance. In Peoria, she would later say that she had always felt like a freak. She had always felt like an outsider. But at Smith College, she became very involved in a number of extracurricular activities like the school newspaper, and she was very involved in activism, left wing activism particularly. And she was a brilliant student. She won all the awards, at Smith. The administrators there said that she was one of the most, if not the most brilliant student that they had ever gone to school there. And so she found a kind of fellowship at Smith College. And she majored in psychology, which is interesting. I think if she had been a man, she might have majored in English, maybe, or tried right away to go into journalism, but she was not really encouraged. The idea then for women, in her milieu, was that you would marry and have children, right? Even if you got this brilliant education. And so, she rebelled against that a little bit in that she majored in psychology. She also wanted to know about herself and her parents. She wanted to know how their brain worked. And of course, this was the time when Freud was first becoming, a fact in the United States. And so that had an effect on her. But she graduated from Smith, and she immediately went for a 1 year to Berkeley, graduate school, to get her PhD in psychology. And she studied with many greats there, like Erik Erikson and other legends, in the field. But she didn't really fit in there either. She became very impatient with academic life, and she wanted to, have a more immediate impact. And she had, as I said, done activism as a college student, and she wanted to return to that. And also, as she writes in The Feminine Mystique, there's a famous scene where she began to date in graduate school. She dated some of Oppenheimer's proteges. And one of them, who she became very close to, supposedly said to her she won a gigantic award in the, right when she arrived, even, at Berkeley. And there's a famous scene in The Feminine Mystique where, she quotes him saying, "I can't go on in this relationship with you because I will never be able to win an award like the one you have won." And so this was for her, this moment at Berkeley, was the beginning of her thinking about men and women, and what did women have to do, or what were they allowed to do versus what were men allowed to do. I mean, she had been thinking about it in college too, but this was a really important moment. So she left Berkeley, and she left graduate school, and she left the academic life, and she moved to New York, where she became a journalist for left-wing newspapers, trade papers, and she covered all kinds of subjects. She covered anti-Semitism, she covered Jim Crow laws, she covered various fascist threats to the United States and Europe. And she churned out stories, and I think she really loved doing that. She was living in Greenwich Village after the war with two other women in the apartment, and she was having this kind of New York Greenwich Village life. And then she met her husband, Carl, and they got married, but she didn't want to stop working. Right? A significant thing for her was she did not want to be like her mother. So she continued to work. Even as she began to have children, there are accounts of her going back to work something like a month after she had her eldest son and then her second son. She was very eager to get right out there in the street and interview people and so on. But as the family got bigger, it became clear that they would probably have to leave Manhattan and move, to the suburbs or the exurbs. So first they moved to Queens. In Queens, they lived in a community that was a community where a lot of UN staff people lived, and Betty really liked that. She lived in a townhouse there, and she liked the fact that other people, she could see other families, and it was semi-communal, right? Everyone lived in their houses, their individual houses, but there was a courtyard and people knew each other and so on. She liked that a lot. But then they left there as they had more children and moved to Rockland County, New York, what used to be known as the Palisades, right across from what used to be known as the Tappan Zee Bridge. And Betty eventually moved into a gigantic Victorian house, really huge Victorian house. And at that point, she had 3 children. She had 2 sons and a daughter. And the sons were maybe, I don't know, 8 and 10 or 6 and 8. And the daughter was an infant. And she had to give up, obviously, when they moved to Rockland County, she had to give up her journalism job. And she began to freelance, but she made a shift in her career from working in these left-wing magazines and newspapers, which were vanishing, of course, because now we're in the McCarthy era. And she began to write for women's magazines, so more mainstream publications like Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping and magazines like that were very mainstream magazines that ran a wide variety of articles, but they were really geared towards middle class women. And so she was doing that. She was writing for those magazines on, again, a kind of variety of topics, but mostly about women and somewhat about housing, the arrangement of housing. And then by this time, she had already gone to her 10th reunion at Smith, and that was in 1953. And she noticed that very few women were still working. And so she began to get this idea that she should create a survey, which she called the questionnaire. And at her 15-year reunion, which was in 1957, she should hand out this questionnaire. And the questionnaire had things on it like, are you happy with your life, your private life? Or do you talk to your husband when you're upset? or did you used to work, and what did you do with the children, and so on. Okay, and so at her 15-year reunion, she handed out all these surveys, and she interviewed a number of young women at Smith. And that was really the beginning of the feminine mystique, was her trying to do this on the ground research with her cohort, her Smith cohort. And so the first thing she did out of that was she tried to sell an article about that. And the article, I think the title of it was, Are Women Wasting Their Time in College? Okay. And no one would buy it. No magazine would buy it. Okay. And so Betty was getting very frustrated. But she also, one of her good and bad qualities as a human being was she was very stubborn. So she didn't give up. So she kept sending it to more editors and more magazines, and they kept sending it back, and she kept doing more research. And finally, she put together a book proposal, and she sold it to W.W. Norton. And then she began work on this book. And the book took her that was in around 1958 or so. And it took her about 5 years. It was very difficult for her to write. Her husband was not that supportive. She had these 3 young children. So she herself was trying to juggle writing a book, which is you have to be kind of solitary to do it, right? And in my book, there are a lot of stories about how she dealt with her family when, to carve out time for herself to write, and how she considered that to be one of the most difficult things she ever did. And then the book came out in 1963, and it changed her life in many ways. For one thing, it was a bestseller. So she was able to move the entire family back to New York, back to Manhattan, which she had wanted to do. She hated living in the suburbs. And she moved the whole family into the Dakota, if you know that building in New York, a building where there are many celebrities live there. And so she moved back to New York, and the children started going to Dalton. Okay. The 2 younger children. And she was very in demand in the early 60s. There was the book made a huge splash. Women, as I said, when they read it, many women were blown away and felt less lonely. Looking at how Betty described the isolated life of the suburban housewife. But then there was also criticisms of the book. Some of them were right from the beginning, that Betty did not really address the problems of working class women or Black women. I can tell you what her thinking was about this at the time. I mean, her thinking was women, capital W, and I cannot underestimate or underplay the struggle that it was, the heavy lifting that she did to get people to take the idea of women as a category, women capital W, seriously. That was an enormous heavy lift, and I think she felt, at that time in 1963, and for many years after, she felt that to in any way, I don't know, talk about different categories of women would in some way dilute what she was trying to say. That was her position. So she, as I said, she was heavily in demand as a speaker. The book sold all over Europe. She went to Europe to talk. It sold all over America. People would mob her on the street. It just completely changed her life. And this was the 60s, the early 60s, and it was a very tumultuous time in America. The Civil Rights Act was passed, and so there were advances being made in equality. But Betty was very impatient, as were many other women, and they felt that advances for women were not being made at the same speed as advances for African Americans. So she had started to write a second book, but she abandoned that second book, and she became involved with the women who had been the subject of the second book, who were women after the feminine mystique. In other words, they were women who were working in Washington. They were working really all over, as either in political roles or in many different kinds of roles. And Betty became involved with them, and they asked her, they wanted to found a new national organization for women. And Betty at first refused. She, as she later put it, she had the temperament of a writer. She did not have the temperament of somebody who should be leading a major national organization. But these women persisted, and because she was famous, she was a celebrity, and they thought that she would be, good to have at the head as president of this organization. So eventually in 1966, which is 3 years after The Feminine Mystique was published, Betty became a co-founder of the National Organization for Women. And that occurred at a famous meeting in Washington. That itself was a very tumultuous meeting, where there was a lot of arguing about how specifically this organization should set itself up, what should its mission statement be, and so on. Basically, the National Organization for Women was for women, like it says. It was not anti-men. Betty was very insistent on this. She wanted men to be a part of this organization. Um, she also wanted to support women of other races and classes, which she acknowledged also that she had perhaps neglected somewhat in the feminine mystique. And she wanted to focus on legal issues, on reproductive rights, on childcare, on getting women into political roles of political responsibility in government. Those were the major concerns of the National Organization for Women when it was first founded in 66. And so it started, and reading, when I was doing research for this part of the book, I mean, it was just very moving to be looking in the archives, because another characteristic of Betty's was her energy. And she had unbelievable energy during this period. I mean, she would be, going to Atlanta to start a chapter of Now There. She would be going to San Francisco to start a chapter of Now There. She would be testifying in Washington for some, to overturn some ridiculous sexist law about help wanted ads or stewardesses age limitations or something like that. Her energy was incredible. She was really holding the organization together in a way. I mean, there were many dedicated people who worked for the organization, don't get me wrong, but Betty really pushed it forward. And then in 68 was the founding, or I don't know, birth of Women's Lib. And, what was happening in America was that women all over America were streaming into this movement, into the women's movement. And some of them were young. Betty, it was already in her 40s, and she had 3 children. And she had a very tumultuous marriage. And so younger women who were becoming part of the movement had different ideas about what the women's movement should be and do. Specifically, some of them were very interested in sexual politics, what we would now call probably identity politics or sexual orientation. And they wanted to bring those things into the women's movement. And Betty was against all of that. So there were these clashes between Betty and some other women, and some younger women in the National Organization for Women. And the end of that was in 1970, Betty stepped down from the presidency of the National Organization for Women. She continued to be active in the organization for many years after that, and also to be its critic. But but she was no longer the president. And however, she continued in the 70s to go on and found many other organizations, including the National Women's Political Caucus was one famous one that was just devoted to getting women into political office, which she felt had been neglected. NARAL, NARAL, which was just devoted to reproductive rights, was another one. And then there were, she also co-founded or was involved in the founding of women's banks and other types of women's networking organizations. So she was tremendously active and continued to be tremendously active throughout the 70s. Although, as I said, she drifted a little bit more. She had started out very far on the left, as I said, in the 40s, and she drifted more towards the center right into the 70s and 80s as the National Organization for Women continued to devote itself to sexual politics, which she felt should not be its primary concern. And during the 80s, she became very involved in Jewish, both institutional Judaism. She made several trips to Israel. She helped Israeli women start an independent feminist organization. And she put together her early childhood experiences with anti-Semitism and her crusade for women's equality in a way that she had not been able to do as a younger person. What else do I want to say about her? I mean, I think she is often, I started out by talking about how I discovered when I was working on this essay about her 10 years ago that she had been erased or marginalized. And I think part of that is because, as I said, she became more conservative over time. And even in, even in the 80s, saying that she thought that feminism had gone too far. She wanted to always make it clear that she wanted for women to have families and children. She thought that was important and that the women's movement should not ignore that. But Betty also, the reason or a reason why I think she is somewhat erased today is because one other of her characteristics is her bad temper. She had a bad temper. She was not an even-keeled person, right? And as I said, she knew that, which is why she initially did not want to become head of the National Organization for Women. But even as a child, she had a bad temper. It was her character. And when she became president of NOW, this came out in often ways that were very, I don't know how to describe them. It's hard to talk about them now because this is an older way of being, but they were often, well, maybe you even know some of these things. For example, in 1969, when she was fighting, she fought lesbians. She didn't want lesbians to bring their platform to the center of the National Organization for Women. And so in a famous meeting, she referred to that as the Lavender Menace, which is a kind of hostile phrase. And she could be quite, she could be combative. I mean, she was combative. I want to say, I think she was combative in fighting for women's rights, and she was also combative in fighting against people that she thought would in some way diminish her idea of or her pursuit for women's equality. She later apologized for that remark, as she would always apologize, but she had this kind of almost impulsive way of being that put a lot of people off. And I think that you know, that contributes to why people don't read her enough or talk about her enough, because her contribution is really, really important. And when I was beginning to write this book, I thought a lot about how there is this different standard for women in power, or women at the tops of organizations, and for men. And I don't know if male leaders would be, I don't know, would have been pushed aside in exactly the same way, or with the same force that Betty has been. I'm not sure. I think that's something I would love to hear from you all about. You know, there were many other instances of these things. You know, Betty's fighting that I could tell you about. But she was, you know, her fighting was also her strength. You know, it was what allowed her to continue, you know, trying to achieve women's equality. And she was incredibly heartbroken when the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, did not pass. She considered that to be a devastating blow to the women's movement. She continued to fight and talk about women's equality until the end of her life, advising younger women and mentoring them and telling them to take risks, and in general being a generous person. So I guess my hope is that my book will somehow, I don't know, generate a conversation about her. So I would love to take questions from people. I've been talking for too long. Okay.
Thank you. And I should say that your book on Friedan is a finalist in the National Book Critics Award. So best of luck with that.
Thank you. Thank you.
So if there are any questions, please write them into the chat.
Oh, the chat. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Anyone?
Was she involved with Ms. Magazine?
No, Gloria would never let her write for Ms.
Ooh.
Okay, thank you.
Any
Gloria,
other questions? Joanne?
Since she was from,
What happened to her children?
her children are still alive. They're all very successful,
Good.
and have their own children.
Good.
Mm-hmm.
did she ever, in her later years with ERA and all that, did she ever confront Phyllis Schlafly, being they're both from Illinois originally? I'm kind of curious if you have any insight on that.
Yes, she had several debates with Phyllis Schlafly in the 70s. And I mean, this is typical. This is also, it's partly, you know, when you read old, the media in that era was not kind to Betty. And so she debated Phyllis Schlafly, I think, twice. And both times, excuse me, she lost her cool and said some things that were just, you know, again, she said something like to Phyllis, "You're a witch and I hope you fly away on your broomstick," or something like that. You know, which is really outrageous, right? And it's uncivil, and it's a lot of things. But Betty thought that Phyllis, she said many other things during this debate, you know, things about the ERA, and none of those other things was quoted in the New York Times. That was the one thing that I just mentioned was quoted, and I think it discredited Betty. And I think Phyllis Schlafly saw that Betty would lose her cool in these debates, and she, you know, she capitalized on that.
Are there
Thank
any
you.
other questions?
I don't have a question. I have a comment.
Yes.
I was around that time. I was about 20 years younger, and you didn't mention her hats, which was she had a hat all the time that I remember seeing. But I remember actually Phyllis Schlafly was a witch. She set back the women's movement a century. We still don't have ERA. I
Right.
was an admirer of Betty Friedan. I was not an admirer of many of the other feminists. I I cast my own path also. Um, I went to a professional school rather than become a teacher or a nurse or anything like that. And but I did get married and I did have children, and I agreed with her there. I thought that was a very part of of
Mm-hmm.
of of life. And how do we um, pass down our thoughts to another generation if we don't do that. And I had 2 sons and a daughter, and my 2 sons were fabulous, fabulous fathers. They diapered the babies, and they took care of the babies, and they didn't say, "Here, you change them," or whatever. And they cooked and they helped, and because I taught them that they had to know how to do everything, and so they could sew, and they cooked better, sometimes better than I did, and particularly they used more wine and things that I did. They could do anything that a male could do, and I said a woman could do anything within her physical limits. And so I believed what she believed, and I still do. And fortunately, I have granddaughters. Most of them do believe the same way. And I don't think her name may have been forgotten, but not what she stood for. I mean, I was active in politics. She was really active in politics, and there were pictures with her and with senators and so on. And I remember that. And I was active in the local Democratic committees and that sort of thing. I think she really influenced me a lot, or maybe I would have done it myself anyway. But I was an admirer of her femininity, her type of femininity. Not that you do male bashing or anything like that. It wasn't necessary. You stood up for yourself. You proved yourself. You didn't have to put somebody else down in order to bring yourself up. So I have
Thank
to
you.
read your book. I do want to read
Oh,
your book. It sounds really, really good.
thanks. Thank you.
Thank
There's
you.
a question from Sylvia Garrett. Sylvia?
Hi. I don't actually have a question. I have a comment. Betty Friedan changed my life, turned me upside down, inside out in a wonderful, wonderful way. I was married to, my husband was in medical school, and we were living in student housing. And I wasn't able to go to school at that time because I'd already had our first, my son. And I belonged to, he was at Cedars. It was Cedars Sinai then. And he was, they had a doctor's wife service league. Had no idea what it was, but I joined it, and we did charitable things, and we didn't have any money to contribute, but I went to all the meetings and I volunteered. And there was a lunch meeting one day, and Betty Friedan was speaking. I went to that, and I just sat there and I listened to her, and all my feelings of dis-ease and questions and my discomfort with my life in so many ways. She just opened the door. I had an epiphany, and it was listening to her speak. And after that point, it did change my life. And I got my hands on all the books I could read by feminist authors. And through my life, I volunteered, and I've been to so many marches. In 1988, 87 and 88, I was president of Contra Costa Now. And I just, it just changed my life. And I used to volunteer at Planned Parenthood on Saturday mornings. Sometimes I didn't go to shul because I went to volunteer. There were all these people with the little plastic fetuses and the megaphones trying to keep the women from going in. And, they might have just been going in to get their pap smears, to get their contraceptives, to have just normal medical appointments. So anyway, I felt that was very important. I just wanted to say that when I saw Betty Friedan's name, I thought, I have to listen to this. So I'm going to read your book.
Thank you. Thank you. The amazing
Rachel,
story. Thank you.
Yes, that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was going to ask you, in the feminine mystique, if I'm not mistaken, she refers to the disease without a name.
The
I think
problem.
that
The
the
problem
problem
with
with it,
it.
right, right.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, over the years, was there ever any scientific research to vet any of these theories of hers? And maybe in the decades since, have they become kind of like a legitimate medical explanation? Was it depression? I'm just kind of curious what the science and health was as a result of the claims in the feminine mystique.
I mean, I think people I don't know if I can answer that, but I mean, I think people have built on her research. I would say more journalists have built on it than scientists. Like, for example, Natalie Angier, the New York Times science reporter, about maybe, I don't know, something like 10 years ago, wrote a book about evolutionary biology in women. And now this year there's Kat Bohannon wrote Eve, which is about like women. So I feel like those books are science journalism that are inspired by Betty, even maybe indirectly. But I don't know. I don't know if there's any, if anyone has proven, yes, here's the problem with no name. I don't know.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Anyone
Thanks.
else?
Reva, there's a comment from Susan Light.
Oh.
She writes, her story reminds me of one of my favorite quotes. You cannot choose your battlefield. The gods do that for you, but you can
Wow.
plant a standard where a standard never flew. And
Wow.
this is from Natalie Crane, the author of the quote, and
Wow.
Susan Light just shared with us.
Thank you. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, if there are no more questions, I really want to thank you so much. It's been wonderful, Rachel, to have you. And please buy the book on Betty Friedan, and I think everyone will enjoy it. Thank you. And
Thank you.
On Monday, we have Amos Giora speaking on Israel and what is happening there. So go to under1tent.org and sign up. Again, Rachel, thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.